"Nobody marries a fat girl," she said on a blind date. The Hells Angels grinned. "We'll prove them all wrong." The air in the bustling diner hung thick with the aroma of sizzling bacon and stale coffee, a familiar comfort for many, but for Sarah, it was a crucible of anxiety. This was it, the dreaded blind date. Another attempt, another leap into the unknown, fueled by the persistent, often cruel, whispers of a society obsessed with an unattainable ideal. Sarah, a woman whose heart was as expansive as her generous frame, had spent years navigating a world that judged her before it knew her. Every mirror was a battlefield, every social gathering a gauntlet of imagined stares. Yet, beneath the layers of self-doubt, there was a spark, a resilience forged in countless quiet battles. She had decided to try one more time, to push past the fear and embrace the possibility, however slim, of genuine connection. Her date, a man named Mark, arrived precisely 5 minutes late, a detail Sarah's ever-observant mind catalogued. He was conventionally attractive, with a slicked-back hairstyle and an air of self-importance that seemed to precede him. He offered a perfunctory nod rather than a smile as he slid into the booth opposite her, his eyes doing a quick, almost imperceptible, sweep of her figure before settling on her face. The initial pleasantries were a strained dance of superficial inquiries. Mark spoke mostly about himself, his achievements, his discerning tastes, barely pausing to allow Sarah to contribute more than a polite interjection. He seemed to view the date as an audition, with Sarah as the hopeful, and frankly, somewhat inadequate, applicant. Sarah, accustomed to this dynamic, found herself retreating into the quiet observations that often served as her shield. She noticed the way he flicked imaginary dust from his designer shirt, the slight curl of his lip when he mentioned his ex-girlfriend, and the way his gaze kept drifting towards the entrance, as if expecting someone more interesting to walk in. The conversation limped along, punctuated by awkward silences that stretched like elastic bands about to snap. Sarah attempted to steer it towards more meaningful topics, asking about his passions, his dreams, anything beyond the superficial gloss he presented. But Mark expertly deflected, always bringing the focus back to his own world, his own perceived superiority. He ordered a black coffee, ostentatiously declaring his commitment to health and fitness, a subtle dig that didn't escape Sarah. She, in turn, ordered a latte, a small act of defiance against the unspoken judgment. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah felt a familiar weariness settle over her. She had hoped for warmth, for curiosity, for a flicker of genuine interest. Instead, she was met with a wall of self-absorption and thinly veiled disdain. The spark of hope she had nurtured before the date began was rapidly dimming, replaced by a dull ache of disappointment. She wished she could simply disappear, to melt into the diner's checkered floor and escape the suffocating atmosphere of judgment. Then came the moment, delivered with casual cruelty, that would forever etch itself into her memory. Mark had been expounding on his dating philosophy, a convoluted set of criteria that seemed designed to filter out anyone who didn't fit his narrow, preconceived notions of perfection. He paused, took a sip of his coffee, and then, looking directly into Sarah's eyes with an expression that was half pity, half condescension, he uttered the words. "You know," he began, his voice surprisingly calm, almost matter-of-fact, "the truth is, nobody marries a fat girl." The sentence hung in the air, a venomous dart striking at the very core of Sarah's self-worth. The noise of the diner, which moments before had been a comforting hum, suddenly became a roaring silence in her ears. Her breath caught in her throat, a physical constriction that made it difficult to swallow, difficult to breathe. She felt a flush creep up her neck, a burning sensation that threatened to consume her. Her hands, resting on the table, clenched into tight fists, her nails digging into her palms. It wasn't just the words themselves, though they were brutal enough. It was the detached manner in which they were delivered, as if Mark were merely stating an undeniable scientific fact, a universal truth that Sarah, in her naive optimism, had somehow failed to grasp. There was no malice in his tone, no overt anger, just a cold, clinical assessment that stripped her bare. All the years of fighting against societal pressures, all the internal battles she had waged to accept herself, to find value beyond the superficial, seemed to crumble in that instant. It was as if every insecurity she had ever harbored had been given voice, amplified and confirmed by the stranger across the table. Her mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of hurt, anger, and profound sadness. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to tell him exactly what she thought of his shallow, cruel world. But the words wouldn't come. They were trapped, suffocated by the enormity of the insult. She felt tears welling in her eyes, hot and stinging, threatening to spill over and reveal the depth of her pain. She blinked rapidly, trying to force them back, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Mark, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the devastation he had wrought, continued to gaze at her with that same unsettling blend of pity and condescension. He probably thought he was being honest, delivering a hard truth for her own good. He likely saw himself as a benevolent, albeit brutally direct, mentor, guiding her towards a path of self-improvement, a path, he undoubtedly believed, meant conforming to his narrow standards. He even leaned back slightly in his booth, a posture of relaxed authority, as if he had just delivered a profound piece of wisdom. The silence stretched, excruciating and heavy, filled only by the distant clatter of dishes and the low murmur of other conversations. Sarah felt utterly exposed, vulnerable, as if the entire diner had suddenly fallen silent and was now staring at her, witnessing her humiliation. Her face felt hot, her cheeks burning with shame, a shame that was not her own, but one imposed upon her by the callous words of a man who knew nothing of her heart, her spirit, or her true worth. Yet, unbeknownst to Mark, and initially to Sarah, their corner of the diner was not as private as he might have assumed. Tucked away in a larger booth across the room, near the jukebox that played a mournful country tune, sat a group of men who stood out even in the eclectic mix of diner patrons. They were members of the local Hells Angels chapter, easily identifiable by their leather vests emblazoned with the iconic Death's Head patch, their long beards, and the general aura of seasoned experience that surrounded them. They weren't loud or boisterous. In fact, their presence was surprisingly subdued, a quiet force of nature observing the world from their vantage point. They had been enjoying their coffee and shared plates of hash browns, their conversation a low rumble of camaraderie, occasionally punctuated by a deep laugh. But their attention, subtle as it was, had been drawn to Sarah and Mark's table. They hadn't actively eavesdropped, but the sudden, sharp shift in the emotional temperature of the room, coupled with Mark's distinctly audible declaration, had pierced through their casual chatter. One of them, a burly man with a weathered face and kind eyes that belied his formidable appearance, known simply as Bear, had been idly stirring his coffee when Mark's words cut through the diner's ambient noise. Bear's movements stilled. He slowly set his spoon down, his gaze narrowing slightly as he took in the scene. Beside him, Viper, a leaner, more intense man with a braided beard, had stopped mid-sentence, his eyes, usually sharp and assessing, now fixed on Sarah's clearly distressed face. Roadblock, a mountain of a man who seemed to embody his nickname, simply grunted, a low, guttural sound that conveyed a surprising depth of disapproval. They hadn't exchanged words, not yet, but a silent communication passed between them, a shared understanding of the unfolding drama and the palpable pain radiating from Sarah. They were men who lived by their own code, a code that often valued loyalty, respect, and a distinct intolerance for cruelty, especially towards the vulnerable. They knew the sting of being judged, of being outsiders, of having their worth questioned by a society that often misunderstood them. Sarah, still reeling from Mark's verbal assault, was barely aware of anything beyond her own immediate agony. She finally managed to lift her gaze, meeting Mark's eyes with a look of wounded dignity that surprised even herself. "Is that," she managed to whisper, her voice trembling slightly but holding an unexpected firmness, "is that really what you think?" Her question was less an inquiry and more a challenge, a desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of her shattered composure. Mark, seemingly unfazed by her distress, merely shrugged. "It's just the way things are, Sarah. I'm just telling you the truth. You'd be better off accepting it." His tone was infuriatingly reasonable, as if he were doing her a favor by exposing her to this harsh reality. His words were like a second blow, reinforcing the first, driving the knife deeper. He had not only insulted her, but he was now instructing her on how to process that insult, how to internalize his cruel assessment. A wave of righteous anger, cold and sharp, began to cut through the fog of hurt. It was a familiar feeling, one she had suppressed countless times, but this time, it felt different. This time, it was fueled by an indignation so profound that it threatened to erupt. She looked at Mark again, truly looked at him, and saw not just a man who had hurt her, but but a man who was utterly devoid of empathy, a hollow shell of superficiality. Her gaze then flickered past him, scanning the room for an escape, for a distraction, for anything to break the suffocating tableau. And that's when her eyes met Bear's. For a fleeting second, their gazes locked. There was no pity in his eyes, no judgment, just a quiet, steady understanding, a silent acknowledgement of her pain. And then, something else flickered there, something akin to a challenge, or perhaps, a promise. He offered her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that was both subtle and profoundly reassuring. It was enough to give her pause, enough to make her wonder if she wasn't entirely alone in this moment of public humiliation. The other Hell's Angels, too, had noticed the exchange. Viper's lips, usually set in a stern line, curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. Roadblock, still grunting softly, shifted in his seat, the leather of his vest creaking, a sound that seemed to carry a silent weight. They were not intervening, not yet, but their presence was no longer merely observational. It was becoming an active, if unspoken, force in the room. They were watching, waiting, and in their collective gaze, Sarah sensed a nascent energy, a quiet defiance that mirrored the anger now simmering within her own heart. She looked back at Mark, her resolve hardening. The tears were gone, replaced by a steely glint in her eyes. "You know what, Mark," she said, her voice now clear and steady, devoid of its earlier tremor. "You're wrong. Completely and utterly wrong." She pushed herself up from the booth, the sudden movement causing the table to jiggle slightly, rattling the coffee cups. Mark looked genuinely surprised, his smug expression finally faltering. He hadn't expected defiance, he had expected tears, capitulation, perhaps a meek acceptance of his truth. "I don't need to accept your version of reality," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "And I certainly don't need your permission to be happy, or to be loved." She reached for her purse, slinging it over her shoulder, her movements deliberate and firm. She wasn't going to sit there and endure another second of his condescension. She was done. As she turned to walk away, a sudden, deep chuckle rumbled from the Hell's Angels booth. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but a sound of genuine appreciation, a low, resonant approval that filled the space Mark's cruel words had previously occupied. Bear, still watching her, now allowed a full, slow grin to spread across his weathered face. It was a grin that held a strange mix of amusement, respect, and something else, a hint of mischief, a spark of camaraderie. Viper, too, was grinning, a more predatory, knowing smile that suggested he found the whole situation highly entertaining. Roadblock simply nodded, his massive head moving slowly, a silent endorsement of her courage. The sound of their collective approval, unexpected as it was, sent a jolt of warmth through Sarah. It was a stark contrast to Mark's cold indifference, a sudden ray of light in the dimness of her humiliation. She paused, just for a moment, at the edge of their booth, her eyes sweeping over their faces. In their expressions, she saw not judgment, but a shared understanding, a sense of solidarity. It was then, as she met their approving gazes, that the full weight of the title's promise began to form in her mind. The idea, bold and audacious, began to take root. She turned back to Mark, who was now looking genuinely bewildered, perhaps even a little unnerved by the sudden shift in the diner's atmosphere and the unexpected endorsement from the bikers. "And as for nobody marrying a fat girl," Sarah declared, her voice ringing with newfound conviction, "we'll prove them all wrong." Her declaration wasn't just for Mark, it was for herself, for every woman who had ever been made to feel less than, for every dream that had been dismissed by narrow-mindedness. The Hell's Angels' grins widened. It was clear they understood. They weren't just witnessing a woman stand up for herself, they were being invited into a narrative of defiance, a challenge to conventional wisdom, a declaration of intent. Bear pushed himself up from his seat, a movement that commanded attention without being overtly threatening. He took a few steps towards Sarah, his expression unreadable, and then, with a surprising gentleness, he placed a large, calloused hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm, reassuring. He didn't say a word, but his presence, his silent support, spoke volumes. The other bikers began to rise as well, a slow, deliberate unfolding of powerful figures. The air in the diner crackled with a new energy, a palpable shift from quiet humiliation to an almost electric anticipation. Mark, now visibly uncomfortable, looked from Sarah to the growing semicircle of formidable bikers, his face slowly draining of color. The smugness was entirely gone, replaced by a dawning realization that he had drastically misjudged the situation, and perhaps, the woman before him. Sarah looked at Bear, then at the other bikers, her gaze lingering on their faces. She saw the unwavering support, the unspoken promise of alliance. It was a moment of profound revelation. She had come here expecting judgment, rejection, and had found it, but in an unexpected twist, she had also found champions. Not the kind of champions she might have ever imagined, but champions nonetheless. Their presence, their silent affirmation, was a balm to her wounded spirit, a surge of strength that coursed through her veins. This wasn't just about a blind date gone wrong, it was about reclaiming her narrative, about challenging a world that had tried to define her. The phrase, "We'll prove them all wrong," echoed in her mind, no longer a desperate wish, but a firm resolve, a shared mission. The future, which moments ago had seemed bleak and filled with the sting of Mark's words, now pulsed with an unexpected, thrilling possibility. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that she wouldn't be facing it alone. The Hells Angels, with their silent grins and their formidable presence, had become an unlikely, yet powerful, part of her story. And the story, far from ending in defeat, was just beginning to unfold in a way no one, especially Mark, could have ever predicted. The diner, once a place of quiet despair, was now charged with the energy of a new beginning, a challenge thrown down, and a promise accepted. The sudden, collective rising of the Hells Angels was not a subtle affair. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding of formidable figures, their leather vests creaking, their boots thudding softly on the checkered linoleum. The air in the diner, already thick with the scent of coffee and bacon, now seemed to crackle with an unspoken energy, a shift in the very atmosphere. Mark, who had been enjoying his moment of perceived intellectual superiority, felt the blood drain from his face. His carefully constructed facade of indifference crumbled, replaced by a raw, primal fear. His eyes darted nervously between Sarah, who now stood tall and defiant, and the growing semicircle of bikers, whose silent grin seemed to hold an ominous promise. Bear, his large hand still resting gently but firmly on Sarah's shoulder, was a mountain of a man, his presence alone enough to intimidate. His kind eyes, which had mirrored understanding moments before, now held a steely glint that brooked no argument. Viper, lean and coiled, stood slightly behind him, his predatory smile now fully formed, a silent threat in itself. Roadblock, true to his name, positioned himself almost imperceptibly to block Mark's easiest exit, his massive arms crossed over his chest, a low rumble emanating from deep within him. Mark stammered, his earlier confidence utterly vanished. I was just stating a fact, he managed, his voice a pathetic squeak compared to the low hum of the diner. He looked to the waitress, then to other patrons, desperately seeking an ally, but found only averted gazes or expressions of quiet satisfaction. No one was coming to his rescue. Sarah watched him, a strange mix of vindication and pity swirling within her. The man who had sought to diminish her now looked utterly diminished himself, his arrogance stripped away by the silent, powerful presence of men he clearly feared. Bear's grip on Sarah's shoulder tightened almost imperceptibly, a silent reassurance. He then shifted his gaze to Mark, his expression unreadable, and took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sound of his boots on the floor seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of their corner. Mark flinched, instinctively recoiling deeper into the booth. "You know," Bear's voice was a low rumble, surprisingly calm but undeniably authoritative, "sometimes facts are just opinions dressed up in cruelty." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing Mark to fully absorb their weight. "And sometimes," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "those who speak them learn a little something about respect." He didn't threaten violence, not explicitly, but the underlying message was clear. Mark understood. He scrambled out of the booth, fumbling for his wallet, desperate to escape. He threw a crumpled bill onto the table, far more than needed, and without a backward glance, practically bolted for the diner's exit. The door jingled as he fled, leaving behind a lingering scent of fear and cheap cologne. A collective sigh seemed to ripple through the Hells Angels. Viper chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that held no humor for Mark. Roadblock uncrossed his arms, the slight shift in his posture indicating a threat averted. Bear, still facing the now empty booth, turned back to Sarah, his expression softening once more. "You handled that well, Sarah," he said, his voice genuinely approving. "More than well." Sarah felt a rush of something she hadn't felt in years, pride. She had stood her ground, not just against Mark, but against the insidious whispers of self-doubt that had plagued her for so long. The Hell's Angels hadn't fought her battle for her, not entirely, but their silent support had been the shield that allowed her to wield her own sword. Viper stepped forward, a glint in his eye. "Nobody marries a fat girl, huh?" He repeated Mark's words, a sardonic twist to his lips. "That's a real rich statement from a man who looks like he's never been loved for anything but his bank account." Roadblock nodded in agreement, a deep grunt of affirmation. Bear looked at Sarah, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You said you'd prove them all wrong," he stated, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of her declaration. "That's a big statement, Sarah. But it's a good one." He paused, then gestured broadly to his fellow bikers. "We live by our own rules, Sarah. We know what it's like to be judged by appearances, to have society tell you who you are, or who you can't be. We respect someone who stands up for themselves, who refuses to be put down." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just the compliment, it was the unexpected kinship. These men, whom society often viewed with suspicion or fear, were offering her understanding, solidarity, and respect. It was a stark contrast to the judgment she had received for most of her life. "So," Bear continued, his gaze steady, "how do you plan on proving them wrong? Because around here, when one of us makes a declaration like that, we tend to follow through." His tone was serious, but there was an underlying current of genuine curiosity and a hint of a challenge. Sarah swallowed, her mind racing. The words had come out in a burst of defiance, an almost instinctual reaction to Mark's cruelty. Now, she had to articulate what proving them all wrong actually meant. It wasn't just about finding love, though that was part of it. It was about defining her own worth, her own happiness, on her own terms. It's not just about finding someone to marry me," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "It's about being seen, truly seen, for who I am. It's about not letting other people's narrow-mindedness define my life, my joy, my potential. It's about building a life where I am loved and valued, not despite my size, but because of the person I am, inside and out." She looked at each of them, her resolve firm. It's about showing that love, true connection, and happiness aren't dictated by a dress size or some arbitrary societal standard. Bear listened intently, his head tilted slightly. When she finished, a slow, appreciative smile spread across his face. "Well said, Sarah," he rumbled. "Well said indeed." He took another step closer, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more conspiratorial. "You know, sometimes, proving them wrong requires a little visibility. A little show of force, not with fists, but with presence. A clear message that you are not alone, and that you are worth fighting for." Viper chimed in, and sometimes, that message is best delivered with a bit of a roar. His eyes sparkled with mischief. Roadblock, for his part, simply gave another deep grunt, which Sarah was beginning to interpret as agreement and encouragement. Sarah looked around the diner. The other patrons had mostly returned to their meals, though occasional glances still drifted their way. The waitress, who had witnessed the entire exchange, offered Sarah a small, encouraging smile. The weight of public humiliation had lifted, replaced by a sense of empowerment. What do you mean?" Sarah asked, a flicker of excitement mingling with apprehension. She knew these men operated outside the norm, and their idea of visibility or a roar might be very different from hers. Bear gestured towards their booth. "Our club, the Hell's Angels, we're a family. And we look out for our own. When someone puts a target on your back, even with just words, sometimes it helps to have a few friends who aren't afraid to stand with you." He paused, his gaze assessing. "We're not talking about anything illegal, Sarah. Just a show of support. A public declaration of alliance, if you will. Let the world see that you're not alone in your fight. Sarah's mind reeled. A public declaration of alliance with the Hells Angels? The idea was audacious, almost unbelievable. It would certainly make a statement. It would undoubtedly confound Mark and perhaps even challenge the very societal norms that had fueled his cruelty. It was a far cry from her quiet life, but after years of being invisible, dismissed, and judged, the thought of being seen, truly seen, and having such powerful, albeit unconventional, allies, was incredibly tempting. What would that involve, she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart thumping in her chest. Bear's grin widened, a genuine, warm smile that transformed his weathered face. Well, for starters, how about we finish our coffee? And then, perhaps, we take a ride. Show a few people that Sarah isn't just a fat girl, but a woman with spirit, courage, and friends who believe in her. He looked at his fellow bikers, who all nodded in enthusiastic agreement. Viper even gave a low whistle. The offer was more than just a ride, it was an invitation into their world, into their protection, into a bold statement against the very prejudice Mark represented. It was a chance to transform her humiliation into an act of profound self-affirmation. The path forward was still unclear, fraught with unknowns, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a surge of exhilarating possibility. Her story, which had felt trapped in a cycle of disappointment, was now taking an unexpected, thrilling turn. She looked at Bear, then at Viper and Roadblock, and a small, determined smile touched her lips. This was just the beginning. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of both fear and exhilaration. The offer from Bear, from the Hells Angels, was a seismic shift in her quiet, often self-effacing life. It was a proposition so utterly unexpected, so wildly defiant, that it took her breath away. For years, she had shrunk herself, both physically in her mind and metaphorically in her interactions, trying to disappear into the background to avoid judgment. Now, these men, these formidable, unconventional men, were offering her the exact opposite: visibility, a roar, a public declaration of worth. The thought was terrifying, but beneath the fear, a powerful current of freedom surged. Yes, she whispered, then cleared her throat and said again, louder, firmer, yes. I'd like that very much. Her voice, though still a little shaky, held a conviction that surprised even herself. Bear's smile broadened, a genuine warmth radiating from him that contradicted his imposing stature. Good, he rumbled, a sound like distant thunder. Finish up, boys. He took a step back, allowing Sarah to fully process the moment. Viper gave a sharp, approving nod, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, while Roadblock offered another deep grunt of satisfaction, which Sarah now understood to be his highest form of praise. The other bikers, who had been silently observing, now shuffled, their movements a subtle ripple of excitement. The waitress, who had been hovering discreetly, now approached their table, a knowing smile on her face. Anything else for you, Han? She asked Sarah, her gaze flicking to the bikers with an almost imperceptible wink. Or are you ready for your next adventure? Sarah returned the smile, a genuine, unburdened smile that felt foreign on her face but incredibly liberating. I think I'm ready for the next adventure, she confirmed, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. They settled their bill, the Hells Angels insisting on paying for Sarah's latte, a small gesture that spoke volumes of their newfound camaraderie. As they walked out of the diner, the afternoon sun, which had felt so oppressive earlier, now seemed to gleam with a new promise. The roar of powerful engines greeted them, a symphony of chrome and steel. A line of motorcycles, polished to a mirror sheen, stretched along the curb. Harleys, mostly, each a testament to power and freedom, their exhaust pipes glinting in the light. Bear led her to a sleek, black touring bike, its seat wide and comfortable. Hop on, Sarah, he instructed, his voice gentle. Viper will take the lead, Roadblock will bring up the rear. We'll keep you safe. Taking a deep breath, Sarah swung her leg over the seat, settling in behind Bear. The leather of his vest felt rough against her hands as she gripped his waist, a surge of adrenaline rushing through her. She had never been on a motorcycle before, let alone one ridden by a Hells Angel. This was not just a ride, It was a plunge into the unknown, a defiant leap into a life she was just beginning to claim. Viper kick-started his engine, the roar echoing down the street, followed by roadblocks, and then bears. The ground vibrated beneath them, a primal pulse that resonated deep within Sarah's bones. With a final, shared nod, the convoy began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The diner, with its stifling memories of Mark's cruelty, receded into the background, a rapidly shrinking dot in her rearview mirror. The wind whipped through Sarah's hair, carrying away the last vestiges of doubt and self-pity. She clung to Bear, feeling the powerful engine beneath her, the collective strength of the bikers around her. They rode through the main street of town, past the familiar shops and bustling sidewalks. Heads turned. People stopped, stared, pointed. Whispers followed them, but this time, Sarah didn't shrink from them. She embraced them. She saw a woman gasp, a man lower his newspaper, a group of teenagers pause their conversation, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. For so long, she had been invisible, or worse, seen only through the narrow lens of her size. Now, she was undeniably visible, a woman on the back of a Hells Angels bike, surrounded by a phalanx of powerful machines and even more powerful personalities. She wasn't an object of pity or scorn. She was a spectacle, a statement, a challenge. They rode past the local park, where children played, their laughter momentarily overshadowed by the thrum of the engines. They rode past the upscale boutiques Mark might have frequented, past the kind of places where she had often felt out of place, judged. With every turn of the wheel, with every mile they covered, Sarah felt a layer of old hurt peel away. This wasn't about revenge, it was about reclamation. It was about taking up space, unapologetically, in a world that had tried to make her small. Bear's broad back was a shield, his presence a silent promise. She felt safe, protected, and incredibly, profoundly alive. The Hells Angels, these men society often feared, were not villains. They were her unlikely champions, her silent roar against a world that had tried to silence her. The ride lasted for what felt like an eternity, but also a fleeting moment. They looped back through town, making sure their presence was noted, their message subtly but unequivocally delivered. As they pulled back up to the diner, the engines idling now, the silence felt profound, almost sacred. Bear turned off his engine and looked back at Sarah, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "How was that for a ride, Sarah?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Sarah couldn't stop grinning. "It was incredible," she breathed, her voice still a little shaky from the adrenaline. "Thank you. All of you." She looked at Viper, whose predatory smile was now softened by genuine warmth, and at Roadblock, whose deep grunt was, she was certain, an expression of satisfaction. "That's just the beginning of proving them wrong," Bear said, his tone serious once more. The ride was a statement. Now, the real work begins. The work of living your life so fully, so joyfully, that their words become meaningless. And Sarah did. The ride with the Hells Angels was indeed a beginning. It wasn't a magical cure-all, but it was the catalyst, the spark that ignited a fire within her that had long been dormant. The story of the fat girl and the Hells Angels spread through town like wildfire. Some whispered, some scoffed, but many, particularly women who had felt similar judgment, looked at Sarah with a newfound respect, even admiration. Sarah, no longer shrinking, started making choices that reflected her authentic self. She joined a local hiking group, finding joy and strength in her body's capabilities, not its size. She enrolled in a pottery class, rediscovering a creative passion she had long suppressed. She started dressing in clothes that celebrated her curves, rather than trying to hide them, her confidence radiating outwards. She wasn't trying to conform to anyone's ideal of beauty, she was defining her own. Her path wasn't without its challenges. There were still lingering whispers, still the occasional dismissive glance. But now, Sarah had a shield of resilience, forged in the crucible of that diner, and reinforced by the roar of those motorcycles. She carried the memory of Bear's unwavering gaze, Viper's knowing smirk, and Roadblock's silent strength. The Hells Angels didn't become her constant companions, but they remained a quiet, powerful presence in her life. Occasionally, she'd see them at the diner, and they'd exchange nods, a silent acknowledgement of their unique bond. Bear would sometimes call her Sarah, the woman who proved them wrong, a title she wore with pride. Years passed. Sarah's life blossomed. She cultivated deep, meaningful friendships with people who saw her, truly saw her, for her wit, her kindness, her indomitable spirit. She found a new job, one where her ideas were valued, and her contributions respected. Her world expanded, filled with experiences and connections she had once only dreamed of. And then, unexpectedly, love found her. Not in a carefully orchestrated blind date, but in the most organic, unassuming way. His name was David, a gentle, kind-hearted man she met at a community garden she had started volunteering at. David saw Sarah's generous heart, her infectious laugh, her quiet strength, long before he ever registered her size. He saw her. He loved her for the person she was, entirely and unconditionally. Their connection was deep, built on shared values, mutual respect, and a profound understanding. When David proposed, not with a grand gesture, but with quiet sincerity amidst the vibrant blooms of the garden, Sarah's mind instantly flashed back to that diner, to Mark's cruel words, "Nobody marries a fat girl." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She had proven him wrong in so many ways, and now, in this beautiful, unexpected moment, she was about to prove him wrong in the most literal sense. Her wedding day was a celebration of joy, love, and defiance. She wore a dress that made her feel beautiful, radiant, and utterly herself. Among the guests, tucked away in a corner near the back, sat Bear, Viper, and Roadblock, their leather vests a stark but comforting contrast to the pastel colors of the ceremony. They didn't say much, just offered slow, appreciative nods and quiet smiles. Their presence was a silent testament to the journey, a powerful symbol of the unexpected alliances that had helped Sarah reclaim her life and her narrative. As Sarah stood beside David, exchanging vows, she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had not only proven Mark wrong, but she had proven a whole world of narrow-mindedness wrong. She had shown that love, true connection, and profound happiness were not dictated by arbitrary standards of size or appearance, but by the richness of one's spirit, the courage of one's heart, and the unwavering belief in one's own worth. Her life was not a fairy tale, but it was real, authentic, and filled with a joy she had once thought unattainable. She had learned that sometimes, the most powerful allies come from the most unexpected places, and that true strength lies not in conforming, but in courageously embracing who you are, and in refusing to let anyone else define your story. The Hells Angels had grinned, and in their grin, Sarah had found the courage to claim her own, beautifully defiant, happily ever after. The promise made in that diner, "We'll prove them all wrong," had not just been fulfilled, it had been gloriously surpassed.